Hello and welcome to Sotheby's in London. Today I'm going to be exploring highlights from two very exciting auctions coming up on March 2nd. The first, the Modern and Contemporary Evening Auction, features a number of works by some of the founding fathers of modern art, names such as Monet, Picasso and Magritte, as well as some of the most influential artists of the 20th century, including Fontana and Hockney. And then there's the Now Evening Auction on March the 2nd, featuring new artists alongside established names, including key works by Banksy, as well as a very exciting group of younger female artists, including Rachel Jones and Shara Hughes. But let's start with modern and contemporary, and what is one of my favourite paintings here, a true masterpiece by the great Belgian surrealist René Magritte. And to help me explore this absolutely luminous painting is Thomas Boyd Bowman. Hello.
Hello.
It's such a fabulous painting, and there's obviously a kind of wonderful paradox at the heart of it. What is going on here?
Well, Magritte has turned everything upside down. We've got a vision of the sky during the day in the upper half, and beneath a nocturnal scene lit only by electric light.
And in terms of the provenance of it, 'cause it's a familiar image, but it's got quite an interesting provenance, doesn't it?
It does. It was actually painted for the present owner. Anne-Marie Crewe was the daughter of one of Magritte's most important collectors and supporters, and this painting was done for her, really.
Clearly there have been many different iterations of it. What do we know about this particular one, given that the person it was painted for is still alive?
Well, the idea, this central paradox of the day-night sky composition was first explored by Magritte in the early 1930s. There's this amazing gouache called Poison, where we've got the night sky picked out with stars and the moon beneath the townscape, and then daylight above. But it's not until 1949 that he actually works the idea up into a full oil painting. But for the next 2 decades, he uses and reimagines the scene again and again until we get to this version in 1961, one of the largest, most immersive compositions painted for the daughter of one of his great patrons.
It's really interesting you say it's one of the largest. I wonder what difference the size of it makes to the experience we have of it.
Well, I think it makes it truly cinematic. I think the idea that you stand in front of it and you get absorbed into the different textures of the light and the dark, but also start to see the subtle differences between the qualities of light. Endemic in it is the idea of electric light, daylight, nature versus the human world. But I think it's a fundamental image that we all relate to as we come in and our breath is drawn and we recognise a sense of awe at the simple qualities of light.
Magritte himself was clearly fascinated by the ideas in it. I know it's kind of odd question to ask, but in a sense, what do you think he was grasping for? Why was he so fascinated by this idea?
Well, I think Magritte always tried to grasp for the fundamental in perception, in the idea of what is and what isn't, what we know and what we can't know. And by placing things in paradox or in contrast to one another, we draw out what it is that we think we know and why we know it. And here we've got a sense that we understand that the bottom half is lit by the lamplight and the day sky must be illuminated by the sun. But how can they coexist in the same image? And only really Magritte can make this in such an elegant and beautiful way.
You never tire of just looking at the paradox, do you?
Not at all, no.
Thomas, thank you so much. Now, a number of works from this sale are currently in New York, including 2 artists who need no introduction, Claude Monet and Pablo Picasso. And we can cross over now to Simon Shaw in New York to tell us more.
Thank you, Samira. The late 1930s is arguably the strongest single moment in Picasso's extraordinary career. This is a time when he moves from the intimate, domestic imagery of his happy years with Marie-Thérèse Walter in the early 1930s into an art that's much more engaged, an expressionism which is talking about the Spanish Civil War and the gathering storm clouds of the Second World War. His cipher for the anxiety and terror of the war is Dora Maar, his new lover of the late 1930s. This is Picasso at a moment of transition. We can see in the blonde hair on the left, he's still very much thinking of Marie-Thérèse Walter, the mother of his child Maya. But this profile, with its distortions and with these eyes viewed simultaneously from two different positions, is unmistakable as Dora Maar. Picasso turned to black and white at various moments throughout his long career, and he did it, he said, because it enabled him to think about form in a new way without being distracted by the color. But I think in this case also, it adds an element of great drama to the presentation. It's a very graphic, sculptural picture that evokes the black and white coloration of his great masterpiece of 1937, Guernica. Now, the other great titan of 20th century painting alongside Pablo Picasso is, of course, Claude Monet. And the final years of Monet's career were devoted to one subject only, which was the incredible garden that he had created at his home at Giverny, outside Paris. This late great suite of works is the link between Impressionism and abstraction. In these great works, here's an example from 1914 to 17, Monet eschews the architecture of composition and focuses instead on an all-over treatment of the canvas, which is all about gesture. Look at these richly worked brushstrokes, capturing the moment, the air above the water, the surface of the water, and the depth beneath. It's extraordinary to think that such works were painted during the First World War, and in actual fact, the big guns of the Western Front were able to be heard from Monet's garden at Giverny as he painted a picture like this. This is a work, I think, which really encapsulates the triumph of Monet's journey and the final part of his career, which changed painting forever. Back to you in London, Samira.
Thank you, Simon. Well, here in London, we have 5 more extraordinary works by Claude Monet. And to explore them, I'm joined again by Thomas Boyd Bowman. These are all from quite a pivotal point in his career, aren't they? What can you tell us?
Well, they all date really from the 1880s and 1890s, and in particular the 1890s, the years when he breaks away from the developments of Impressionism and into post-Impressionism. But it's really in the 1890s, through the series pictures, such as the grain stacks and indeed actually images of debacle, such as this work here, where the effect of light is explored to the greatest extent. And in here, it's not just how light forms the parts of the landscape, but the atmosphere itself. We can feel the chill of this deep winter day, but brilliantly illuminated by the sun.
Well, let's go from a winter day to flowers in full bloom, these chrysanthemums. Am I right in thinking that there was a sense of influence of Japanese art?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Japonisme was all the rage in France at the time, and Monet collected Japanese prints. He had a collection of amazing images that had come over from Japan, and they had a profound impact on French artists and artists actually throughout Europe. In particular, it was their breaking down of traditional forms of perspective and representation. But here we have Monet looking at some of the favourite flowers in his garden in an extraordinary way, in a really, really radical manner. By breaking down the traditional horizon line that you might have in a landscape picture, or by presenting a set of pre-arranged items in a still life, he's doing away with the traditional genre picture entirely and creating something new. This is painted in 1897. It's the same year that he starts developing the water lilies as his final triumphant theme that actually occupied the rest of his entire life for the next 2 decades. And in this amazing bloom of colour, we have the first glimpses of his journey towards abstraction.
Exciting. Thomas, thank you so much. We go now with our next group of works from idyllic descriptions of rural France to a very different world, the dramatic upheavals of post-war Italy. And to tell us more, I'm joined by Emma Baker. Hi, Emma.
Hi.
And these are amazing works by an important group of Italian modernists at a time when Italy is in a very difficult place. And of course, they're using different materials and forms, but is there something that we can see they have in common?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's special about these artists is how they reacted to the trauma of the Second World War. For Bury, he was a surgeon during the war, and it was something that he gave up completely when, after the war. He was a prisoner of war in the US, but following the Second World War, he totally gave up medicine, focused solely on creating works of art and using really, really, really simple materials like wood, just sort of your elemental paints, black and red, white, very monochromatic. And for him, it was about regenerating and sort of looking back, but also looking forward and trying to find a way through the trauma whilst acknowledging it.
So the materials that he uses, how did he come to choose them and what was he trying to achieve with them?
Following the Second World War, I think Bury was really looking to try and find a new avenue for expression in artistic creation and painting. So rather than sort of the modernists of the pre-war era that were using oil on canvas, he was using sort of everyday materials that speak to our lives, that we recognize, and that he doesn't manipulate and he doesn't impart his own gesture upon. So it's as though these materials and these very sort of humble materials speak for themselves.
Emma, to what extent could you say that Bury is the father of arte povera?
Absolutely, yeah. So he really is considered sort of the godfather of that whole movement of the 1960s. And I think it was because he was using and elevating these sort of poor materials, the povera materials that sort of are related in the name, that really he was picked upon by the next generation of artists in the later 1960s, and they started to embrace his way of approaching materiality in their own work. So he is the forefather of arte povera, definitely.
There's this sense of artists trying to do new things in post-war Italy. If we look at this Fontana, he was really interested in pushing at the dimensions of art, wasn't he?
Totally. I think you see the dialogue between both of them. So where Bury was really sort of taking the trauma of the Second World War and injecting it with this new formalism and new materials, Fontana was looking to this completely new dimension in the world of art and looking towards sort of space and mixing of art and science. He did this manifesto in 1946, literally just after the war, which was a spatialist manifesto, and he was all about looking to a sort of a contemplation and an expression of nothingness. And you can sort of see that in this form here, which is very planetary, very cosmological. But the way that it's cleft in two is like he's trying to sort of disrupt that homogeneity. And that's definitely picked up on between these works, the central rip in this Bury picture and the schism in this sculpture by Fontana, which is also what he was doing in his paintings. So if we look at the work over here, which is an iconic Fontana canvas from the mid-1960s, you can see him using the same sort of dialogue, the same sort of cleaving of the canvas picture plane to intimate at a fourth dimension, the sort of space-time of the art world, which is why he's so innovative, really.
Emma, thank you so much. There is one other post-war Italian work in this sale, and that's a canvas by Domenico Neoli. And here to talk about it is Hayley Stoddard. Hi, Hayley.
Hi, Samira.
This is quite different from the other Italian works we've been looking at. What was Neoli doing that was so different from his contemporaries? I mean, this is a piece of cake, isn't it?
It is indeed. This painting is entitled La Tranche, or The Slice, from 1965. And Neoli's approach was very different from his arte povera contemporaries, such as Fontana, Castellani, and Bury. Rather than focus on pure abstraction, Neoli was very interested in analytical, documentary, still life painting. And here we see Neoli's wonderful attention to detail, particularly in the piping on top of the cake and in this delicate lace tablecloth, which acts as a ground for the composition.
Well, there's almost a kind of glittery sense of glamour about it. Is it a kind of comment on consumerism in the way that his American contemporaries in pop art were?
I think Neoli's conceptual approach is actually quite different from his pop art contemporaries. This work does depict a slice of cake. So we think of Wayne Thiebaud and his incredible compositions of cakes and pastries and confectionery in the United States in the 1960s. But I think Neoli's approach, you don't see the same sense of cynicism and irony in Neoli's work as you see in Warhol's soup cans or Lichtenstein's comic strip paintings. I think Lichtenstein and Warhol were trying to make a critique on mass consumerism, but rather Neoli's approach is much more meditative and philosophical. He was much more interested in really depicting the inherent beauty of objects rather than making a commentary on social values.
Now from post-war Italy, we move on a decade or so to an American abstract painter known for her powerful visions of the world. This is such a monumental work, isn't it, by Frankenthaler, and it's a colour-field painting, is that right?
It is absolutely a colour-field painting. This work is entitled Tournament from 1977 and is a brilliant example of Frankenthaler's mature practice and her investigation into abstraction. So her colour-field painting builds upon her predecessors, such as Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman. She's using a very innovative technique of soak staining, and this work in particular is such a large-scale example. It measures over 2.5 meters high, and it really engulfs the viewer in chromatic splendor. And we see these wonderful colors of electric yellow and blue collide. It's a really wonderful example from the late 1970s.
I love your phrase, chromatic splendor, and I wonder, given the scale of it, what insights you could offer about her technique and the effect it has.
Absolutely. I briefly mentioned her soak staining technique, which she began working with in the early 1950s. She would pour thinned down oil paints, or later acrylic paints, onto unstretched, unprimed canvases, which would sit flat on her studio floor. Or the paint would permeate the canvas weave, and in that sense, the canvas really becomes part of her media. Her work completely marked a departure point from that of Jackson Pollock, who was looking to build a very worked up, textured surface, whereas Frankenthaler's surface in comparison is very flat and one-dimensional. So she's looking to imbue on the surface of the canvas a sense of monumentality and purity through the use of color and the canvas weave.
Now, there are comparisons made between Frankenthaler and Monet, including in a kind of current show in London at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Is that a good comparison, and if so, why?
I think it's a lovely comparison between Monet and Frankenthaler. Currently at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, there is presented side by side one of Monet's water lilies and one of Frankenthaler's canvases from the same period that Tournament was executed, the late 1970s. And you really see both of these artists, even though they were working 1 century apart, they're both really exploring the possibilities of color and the way color moves on the surface of the canvas.
Thank you. From Frankenthaler's brooding but luminous image to an altogether more exuberant painting, and one that's one of the real highlights here, I think, A Landscape by David Hockney. Well, joining me here to talk about this absolutely wonderful image is Tom Edison. Tom, this is Hockney surveying obviously a much loved landscape. And this is presumably a work back in the UK after his major move back from California, isn't it?
It is. So we're standing in front of this glorious Edenic landscape, this green and pleasant land that's Hockney's Garraby Hill. And he first did it in 1998. And he was living in California at the time, but he actually came back to Yorkshire, both because his mother was quite ill and a dear friend, Jonathan Silver, was suffering from cancer at the time. So he'd come back from LA to Yorkshire, and really the first time in about 30 years he'd been in the UK for a long period. And when he was back, he was making a journey every couple of days from his mother's house in Bridlington in East Yorkshire across to Saltaire, where Jonathan was recovering. And that journey would take about 60 miles there and 60 miles back. And he had these long meandering drives that actually echoed what he was doing in California.
Oh,
you think about the
canyons,
Pacific
yeah.
Coast Highway, Mulholland Drive and Nichols Canyon, and great paintings of the early 90s. And he'd gone back to California, and he made the painting Garraby Hill whilst back in California as a sort of memory of this great moment and this great homeland of his. And it was a monumental moment for Hockney. That painting is a masterpiece within Hockney's career and is housed in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and marked a real moment for him in terms of landscape painting.
And Tom, tell me about the other Hockneys that are in this sale.
Yeah, so we're incredibly privileged to be offering 3 other works by Hockney in our sale. The first of which is from 1965, an early painting, a painted landscape, or red or blue landscape. Secondly, we have the first very new painting from 1992, which is really a wonderful small work, which is from a body of work which looks at perspective, composition, and it's quite abstract in feel. And then we have, really excitingly, a work from 2010, Walgate Woods Winter, which is a wonderful, mesmerizing video installation that charts an hour journey through his beloved Yorkshire. This one, the winter scene, he did spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And it's a really captivating work. And I think what we have here are 4 works that not only chart chronologically Hockney's career, but really show his evolution as a master of challenging and changing modes of depiction, and that really mark him as arguably, one of Britain's greatest ever painters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom.
My pleasure.
We move on to the Now evening auction, which brings together a tightly curated selection of works by some of the most sensational artists working right now. And we're going to begin by looking at a group of works which are by artists who are very exciting, very young, or happen to be women. And to take me through them, I'm joined by Marina Ruiz-Colomer. Hello, Marina.
Hi.
This is such an exciting display of works by young artists. Can you give a sense of what is so special about these works?
Absolutely. I think this is a particularly special room because all of the artists here are women. And I feel it's very special to have this group of works because not only it is by women, but it's also by quite young artists. So it's quite exciting to see what they are doing and how they're taking on painting as a genre, which has historically been so gendered and so masculine, and turning it on its head and interpreting it in a different way.
So it's paintings, but in terms of the approaches, the forms, do you see any themes in common?
Some, yes, absolutely. I think there's quite a good sense of self in these paintings and an exploration of what one can say with painting about their identity. So, for example, with this painting by Rachel Jones, it's amazing, the layering of the colors, it's so vibrant, but at the same time, the subject we're seeing here, which at a first glance might look very abstract, is actually a mouth. And what Rachel Jones does so well in her work is this duality between abstraction and figuration. And with the subject of the mouth, what she's doing, she's looking at the inside and the outside of the body. And mouths are this entry point almost to, the identity and the notion of the self. So it is very interesting to see a young artist approach painting in such an original way.
And given that these artists are young, what is it that you'd say makes them so important to watch?
I would say they've had interesting exhibitions. So Rachel Jones was included in the Hayward show recently, mixing it up. And then someone like Shara Hughes, for example, she has had a fabulous show at the Garden Museum here in London, among many others. And she's got an exciting show coming up later in the year. So I would say institutional representation is quite exciting. But also, she is also looking at this marriage of abstraction and figuration, and she's taking on the subject of flowers and gardens, which again, historically have been so gendered and so associated with women and the female. And we might look at this and think of Georgia O'Keeffe, and it's something that almost immediately springs to mind. But, again, with Georgia O'Keeffe herself, she thought that our link of her work to the female form was quite reductive, and Shara Hughes herself finds this quite problematic. And she says that her flowers, yes, they stand in for people, for figures, but some are her flowers or her trees. They are female, some of them are males, and some of them are genderless. So I think it's, again, quite a fresh approach to looking at this notion that in the canon of painting has been very connected to women, and doing it in a very different and new way, while at the same time technically the painting is beautiful and amazing.
Absolutely. Marina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have a captivating work by Hervin Andersen, and it's a painting that's packed with art historical references, as well as referring to Britain's very recent past. And once again, I'm joined by Tom Ellison to talk about it. It is such a remarkable image, isn't it? Tell us a bit about the artist's background and the kind of influences that are at work in this piece.
Well, I think first and foremost, this is a really beautiful, glorious painting, and I think what strikes one immediately is the painterly dexterity in which Andersen, arguably one of Britain's most celebrated painters in Britain today, has attacked this canvas. You have this wonderful array of washes and translucent glazes, flicks of oranges and pinks to make up this sort of lush vegetation. Ostensibly, this is a beautiful Quotidian lake scene. It has this sort of serene air, but there's a sort of silence about it. And whilst it's not deafening, there's a certain hum of disquieting nature I find about it. And that's so evocative of what Andersen does in his paintings. His works are about memory and place and longing of history. Andersen is a native of Birmingham. He was a second generation from the Windrush generation. And this is a painting from 2006, Lower Lake 3, and was actually painted when he'd just come back from residency in Trinidad. And it's looking back at the lake in Handsworth Park in Birmingham, where he grew up. So it creates this sense of memory of his childhood in this sort of old Victorian park. And much of Andersen's work is from his history, from growing up, and the nature of which migrants have come to Britain post-war. A lot of those scenes are leisure scenes in these parks. You look at the ball watching series, you have these Quotidian, beautiful sort of leisure scenes, evocative of really the great 19th century painters like Seurat or Manet. But what Andersen does is sort of subvert that into today's society, or the society that he grew up in, and this sort of colonial history overlooking a lot of those generations.
Tom, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And now to our final group of works, and another artist whose images engage in a very direct way with the political and social fabric of modern Britain. I'm joined here again by Emma Baker, and we have some really famous Banksy images. I recognise all of them. These three are drawn from the collection of Robbie Williams, aren't they?
Yeah,
what do we have here?
They are. So all three pieces from a Robbie Williams collection, and he, like sort of most of us, loves Banksy for that mixture of comedy and controversy, and you really get that coming across in these three works, which are incredibly famous as motifs, and they all started life as street murals. So this one over here, the Choppers, first appeared in Shoreditch, and this one over here, the Kissing Coppers, appeared outside a pub in Brighton in 2004, and then Girl with Balloon, which is arguably his most iconic or famous motif, first was around on the streets in London around 2002, 2004, underneath Waterloo Bridge.
And in terms of motifs, they are really important ones, aren't they? What do they represent in terms of Banksy's interest?
Sure, definitely these two speak to kind of the protest element of his art. This one, Choppers it's called, is a vandalised oil. So you get this piece which is based on like a pastoral landscape, sort of Claude Lorraine-inspired chocolate box landscape, and over the top he's done his graffiti, Choppers, sort of Vietnam War.
You could actually hear the blades.
You can, it makes you think of Apocalypse Now and all of those sort of war films. But what's great about this is that it was created around 2000, the mid-2000s, when it was very contentious. There was a lot of anti-Iraq war protesting. Banksy was very vociferous during the march in 2003. So that actually does play a massive part in the imagery he's sort of making. It's poppy, it's very funny, but there's also an undercurrent of protest and sort of sticking up for the marginalised. And
what about this one in terms of motif? You said Brighton is where it was originally.
Yes, yeah. It's like perfect. It became like an icon in Brighton when it was done. 2004 was quite a pertinent year. So in 2003, the Sexual Offences Act finally got passed in its entirety, which meant that no longer could gay sexuality be penalised in the criminal code. So very pertinent, and Banksy did this in 2004 outside a pub in Brighton, and it did really become an icon. And it's, again, Banksy sort of looking at sort of the establishment. He's very an anti-establishment figure, and sort of ridiculing those sort of pillars of authority.
And the motif in this one?
And the girl with balloons, so again, this is a very famous motif. People would recognise it from the shredding that happened here at Sotheby's. More recently, it came back to our sale room. And this is, yeah, it's his sort of signature kind of calling card. It's the image that you see people have had tattoos of. You see it sort of like in various posters of various fake versions. But for him, it sort of means like a loss of innocence, I think. The balloon slipping away from the child is that sort of innocence lost. And he always uses it in a way that disrupts that image and sort of takes away sort of the saccharine quality. So on here you get this real sense of grittiness, this real street aesthetic, which for me directly relates back to what it originally was on the walls just underneath Waterloo Bridge.
I mean, you talked about the importance of the fact that, you know, many of his works started as street art, but there are works that are painted as paintings. I wonder how important the origins of each work is to Banksy.
I think really important. I think for Banksy, he always creates the street original and then creates a work of art from that. So there's this real dialogue between the two pieces, and the street murals exist as murals in their own right. You know, they're street art, they're for everyone to see, whereas these works are his sort of studio production, and it's what people collect and what sort of, you know, as an owner of a work by Banksy, this is what you would sort of look to acquire. And there's always that dual dialogue, you know, with the mural in Brighton, and you get the painting and the mural on the South Bank and the painting, and same here. And I think the best works really were always street pieces first.
Emma, thank you.
Thank you.
You know, it's been a real privilege to share with you some of the highlights of these two sales, featuring many of the greats and some of the most exciting contemporary artists working today. And if you're in London, you can come and see all of the works for the sales at Sotheby's New Bond Street galleries from the 22nd of February. Do come if you can, and you can watch the auctions live on the evening of March the 2nd. From me, though, thank you for watching.